public is conditioned to watch the skies for missiles. This is a strategic misdirection. A kinetic exchange is a terminal zero-sum equation. It is the last resort of a failed state, not the opening move of a calculated actor. The primary vector for modern conflict is not loud. It is silent. The attack is not aimed at cities, but at the systemic choke points of the global economy. CSIS and RUSI reports confirm the primary vulnerability: the subsea data cables through which 97% of all global data and financial transactions flow. Simultaneously, the targeting of low Earth orbit satellite constellations creates a sensory deprivation event. This is not about destroying military assets. It is about inducing a state of systemic paralysis. The objective is to create a blind Leviathan, a superpower that cannot clear a transaction, verify a data packet, or communicate with its own assets is rendered inert. It becomes a behemoth of kinetic potential, thrashing in the dark, unable to trust its own senses. Its economic interdependence becomes the vector for its collapse, triggering a solvency crisis. This is the blueprint. Force the stronger power into a kinetic response born from financial desperation, not military strategy. The attack isn't the explosion. The attack is the silence that precedes it. The pivot to asymmetric escalation is not a strategic choice. It is a mathematical function of insolvency. When a state actor's domestic liabilities reach a critical threshold, conventional warfare becomes a political and financial impossibility. The conflict is no longer a projection of strength, but a launch-on warning protocol against internal collapse. CSIS analysis frames this vector with chilling clarity. An unpopular war acts as a domestic liability accelerant. When the kinetic cost of conflict exceeds the political capital required to sustain it, the regime is forced into a solvency crisis. It cannot afford a symmetric, protracted engagement. Its very survival depends on bypassing the battlefield. This weakness mandates a pivot. The strategic objective is no longer to defeat an army, but to engineer a systemic cascade failure within the adversary. The blueprint shifts from kinetic engagement to attacking choke points. Per Bloomberg analysis, the oil market is a primary target. A credible threat to energy supply lines is not a military tactic. It is an economic weapon designed to trigger a liquidity crisis in the stronger power. The endgame is to weaponize the opponent's interdependence. By attacking a systemic node, financial protocols, energy markets, or alliance tripwires, the weaker actor forces a disproportionate response. They create a scenario where the only way for the superpower to stop its own economic hemorrhaging is a kinetic escalation, but one born from financial desperation, not strategic advantage. They turn strength into a fatal liability. The core calculation has been inverted. The kinetic cost of projecting power has collapsed. Data from the Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, quantifies this new asymmetry. A $5 million main battle tank can be neutralized by a $500 FPV drone. This is not a battlefield anomaly. It is the new mathematical reality. This protocol is known as the democratization of violence, the process by which high-end military lethality is made available at a consumer price point. Any actor with minimal capital can now acquire the means to threaten systemic choke points previously secured by trillions in defense spending. The economic incentive is no longer to build a rival army, but to invest in cheap, disposable assets that transform an adversary's expensive legacy platforms into smoldering financial liabilities. The battlefield is no longer a physical territory. The blueprint for asymmetric escalation identifies and weaponizes gray zones, the systemic seams of the global order. These are not nations, but protocols, straits, and digital networks. The strategic objective is to stage attacks in these zones to trigger a solvency crisis, not a military conflict. Analysts at CSIS define the primary gray zone as digital. Estonia became the frontline laboratory for this doctrine. As documented by New Lines magazine, the country was subjected to a coordinated, state-level cyber assault targeting its banking, media, and government infrastructure. This was not a trial run. It was the establishment of a protocol. Incapacitate a NATO member's civil function without a single kinetic asset crossing the border, testing the alliance's tripwire response. The second vector is physical choke points. Bloomberg reports confirm that any escalation with Iran directly threatens the 20% of global oil supply transiting the Strait of Hormuz. Weaker actors are mathematically incentivized to threaten this artery. The goal is not to win a naval battle, but to inject extreme volatility into energy markets, creating a global crude supply shock. This forces a solvency-based response from adversaries as nations like India are exposed to extreme tariff pressure and supply disruption, per the Times of India. The most advanced gray zones are entire nations, used as proxy laboratories to test systemic fragility. Internal instability in countries with critical resource dependencies, warnings from South Africa's platinum group metals sector, or Canada's agricultural supply chains are cited by RUSI as examples, are not local problems. They are opportunities to study the cascading effects of supply chain collapse on Western economies in a controlled environment without triggering a direct military confrontation. The endgame of staging attacks in these zones is to expose the fatal liability of the current financial architecture. When the system itself is the target, holding assets within that system becomes a strategic error. This is why, according to International Banker, the conversation around central banks acquiring Bitcoin and other non-sovereign assets is accelerating. It is not an investment. It is an escape vector from a system being deliberately pushed toward a launch-on-warning state of financial desperation. The protocol is known as launch-on-warning. It dictates that the decision to trigger a full-spectrum kinetic response is not made upon impact, but upon the detection of an inbound threat. The timeline from initial warning to irreversible launch is measured in minutes. There is no committee meeting. There is no debate. It is a mathematical calculation designed to prevent a decapitation strike that would neutralize retaliatory capability. This doctrine, however, was engineered for an analog world of radar and seismic sensors. It presupposed the integrity of the data. Now that assumption is the central vulnerability. The new blueprint for conflict, as detailed in CSIS threat assessments, is not to launch a missile, but to launch a cyber attack that mimics a missile launch. This creates the fog of digital war. If an adversary can blind early warning radar systems or more critically inject false data to spoof a mass launch, the command authority is presented with a binary choice based on corrupted information. They are forced to assume the data is real. To hesitate is to risk the complete loss of their strategic arsenal, rendering them defenseless. The weaker actor has now successfully bypassed the kinetic cost of engagement. They have not fired a shot, but have forced the stronger power to the precipice of global escalation. The strategic objective is achieved. Create a solvency crisis in the adversary's most critical system, their chain of command. This turns their technological superiority into a systemic liability, forcing a launch decision born from digital panic, not military necessity. The calibration shot is the opening protocol in asymmetric escalation. Its purpose is not destruction, but data collection on an adversary's systemic response. It is a mathematically precise stress test designed to measure two variables: political will latency and the financial pain threshold. It is a launch-on-warning system in reverse, designed to see how close to the kinetic tripwire one can operate before triggering a solvency crisis. Within 12 months, expect a targeted 48 to 72-hour data blackout at a critical Baltic Sea port. The digital logistics and customs clearing systems will cease to function. This is not a random attack. It is a calculated probe of a NATO tripwire, consistent with the gray zone tactics observed on the Estonian front line. The objective is to paralyze a physical choke point via a non-kinetic attribution impossible vector. It will be publicly framed as a sophisticated ransomware incident, not an act of war. The true target is not the port. It is the alliance's decision-making matrix. RUSI analysts note that the attacker will measure the political hesitation and the immediate economic cost of the supply shock. This data calibrates the level of pressure required in the next phase to force an adversary into a kinetic response born from financial desperation, not strategic advantage. The event will establish a baseline for how much economic liability a mutual defense treaty actually represents.